All right, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. Today I'm joined by Reed Galen, who is the president of the pro-democracy coalition called the Union. He is the co-founder of the Lincoln Project, Political Action Committee, and he's the host of the Homefront podcast and author of the Homefront Substack. So Reed, thanks for coming on today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, just to start off, when did you first get interested in the world of politics?
So I was born into it. My dad worked on Capitol Hill from the time that I was maybe 3 or 4
Okay.
in Washington, D.C. I grew up in Northern Virginia. So yeah, as I like to say, other kids went to summer camp and I went to the National Republican Congressional Committee. So yeah, I have known it since I was probably 7 years old, 6 years old.
So it's always been a big part of your life then, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was editor of my high school newspaper. So when I got to college, I wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein. But given the vagaries uh, of applying for classes and registering for classes at the University of Texas in the mid '90s, it was going to take me like 6.5 years to get through all the journalism classes. So I
Oh, wow.
opted for political science and government instead.
Yeah. And so, when you were a kid, how did you envision like your future would be in the political realm? Did you ever envision that you'd kind of take on this pro democracy fighting force that you have become with the Lincoln Project and the Union?
When I was a kid, no. I mean, I did grow up in Washington, D.C., but, everybody in Washington, D.C. was connected to the government or politics
Sure.
somehow for the most part. I had a friend whose dad was a defense contractor. I had another one was a Marine helicopter pilot who was assigned to the Pentagon. One other guy in my neighborhood, worked at the CIA. My mom worked, for a big company in town, and then worked at the transportation department, I think during the Reagan or the Bush administration. So it was just sort of part of life, right? It wasn't, it's a company town.
Yeah.
But if I had any idea of sort of like where I would be now when I was then, absolutely not. I mean, I did my first Republican National Convention in 1992 when I was 16. But again, I was in high school, sophomore in high school at that. So yeah, it wasn't really something I looked at. And frankly, at the time, like, there were Republicans and Democrats, but it wasn't as if democracy in and of itself was an issue, right? We took it
Right.
for granted. And
Yeah.
when I was a kid, in Ronald Reagan's Washington, D.C., we knew who the bad guys were, and they weren't the Democrats, they were the Russians.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I feel like even when I was growing up, obviously from a different generation than you, but it still felt like, you know, the world of politics is a world where we're just trying to make progress, and we're continuing to make progress and kind of move in the right direction despite kind of the struggles that we have as a society. And, historically that can often be the case, but it feels like now we've kind of reached an era where it's like we're going backwards and we're trying to prevent ourselves from sliding even further back, and even into unprecedented territory. So it really is kind of scary to see like kids today are now growing up in a political environment where it's just not recognizable at all to Americans throughout history.
No, I mean, yeah, probably right up until the Civil War,
Right, of
right?
course. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I mean, again, we took so much for granted, even really up through, when I worked for President Bush, and then when I worked for Senator McCain, in the 2008 cycle, it just wasn't something that was really imaginable, if that makes sense. And
Yeah.
if there was a big mistake that we all made in 2016, it was just a massive lack of imagination. That not only that a guy like Donald Trump could enter politics as he did, win the Republican nomination, and then beat Hillary Clinton. Again, none of us thought it was possible. It was just too insane, right? It
Yeah.
was, you had to believe it to see it. And unfortunately, we all saw it due to our lack of belief. So I think that, now you're right. I mean, everything is topsy turvy. Everything is bare knuckle brawls. Now, look, American politics throughout its history from the beginning has been very rough,
Of
right? It's
course.
it's been tough, but not, but political violence, the likes of which we have now seen in the last, I'd say, decade, really got sort of wrung out of our system, in the late '60s and the early '70s. And so we had this again, another 50-year respite where that kind of thing really passed out of American collective memory until it showed up on our doorstep. And I remember on January 6th, 2021, a friend of mine, an Egyptian friend of mine who had been in Tahrir Square that day, said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I'm not." And he said, "Well, I understand that because, once political violence re-enters the field, it's very difficult to get it out again."
Yeah.
And so that's what concerns me, not only for the country writ large, but yeah, for those who are now, my kids' age, 12 and 14, who are trying to make sense of a world that makes very little sense.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right because I mean, yes, historically, the United States has been a country that's always had major challenges, whether it's becoming a country in the first place or the Civil
Right.
War or the 60s era that tore the country apart in many ways. Um, the thing that I think that strikes me most, thinking as a historian about like what just bothers me most about this era is that it's the first time we've had a president that didn't actually accept election results. Like even the Civil War, they accepted the results. They just want to break away from the country because they didn't like the direction it was going. They wanted to, preserve, slavery in the South. And it's
Right.
just like, this is unbelievable that we're in 2024. And not only is a person that rejected it once is run again, but he could win again. And it
Yeah.
just seems like how did we get to the point where we could let this happen?
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I think you make a really good point about 1860. It was because the South accepted the fact that Abraham
Right.
Lincoln had won that they decided to secede, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't because they didn't believe
Right.
he did. And I think you're right. I mean, we always, we have held in this high regard in this vaulted place in our world the idea of the peaceful transition of power, right? That on the day of the inauguration, January 20th, every 4 years, right, that there's a 21 gun salute by the army, right, on the west front of the Capitol, representing that the military is under civilian control, that it is paying service and homage to the civilian ruler, and that is as close as we get, right, to violence, is simulated artillery fire, right? I mean, I mean, it makes noise, but
Right.
there's no
Right.
shell in it, right?
Yeah.
And so, we took that for granted. But I think also, as throughout history, uh, you know, once people are confronted with an outcome they too couldn't believe, right, and are told by the person that you shouldn't believe what happened, and in fact you should believe it was stolen from you, and that all of the things that have occurred since that theft have been legitimate actions and reactions to that heinous act, and I'm putting this in the context of someone who
Sure.
believes that Donald Trump won,
Right.
then everything's on the table. They're not going to steal it from us again. We're not going to let it happen again. They did it once, and so, and it's also, look, as as a historian, like, repetition matters, right? As someone in politics, like, you don't have 82 different messages. You have like one message you say 82 different ways, and you say it
Sure.
over and over and over again. But if you already have tens of millions of people in your sway politically, mythically, psychologically, emotionally, and they want to believe that you won, because the world that they now have to deal with is one that is fundamentally different than they'd encountered before in their lives, or is fundamentally different than how they thought their own life was going to turn out, and they found their tribune to say, yes, you should be angry, and you should be angry at them. I think, here we are now, 7 weeks away from Election Day 2024, and we're seeing the effects of that in real time.
Yeah, yeah, it's it's wild because I mean the information gap has gotten so large now. If you're a diehard Trump supporter, you're living in a completely alternate reality from someone outside of that MAGA movement,
Right.
and it's so different that it's really hard to reconcile those differences. It does seem fairly similar to some of the things I've experienced, visiting Russia, for example. My father's a Russian historian, and we'd travel there, when I was a kid. And, you'd get
Mhm.
people that are in these silos where they think, all these things about the world and what's happening. And it's very similar to the Trump movement when talking to Trump supporters.
Right.
Um, and of course, once that cord of information is broken connecting the two sides, you start to think, okay, this is really dangerous and is situation, and could spiral out of control if we're not careful.
Well, it already has,
Yeah,
right? I
well,
mean,
yeah.
we've already seen it
I was thinking
spiral
it's
out
gonna
of
get
control.
worse. So I'm hoping it
Yeah,
doesn't get
it
worse. Yeah,
no, I hope not either,
yeah,
obviously. Yeah, I mean, I think we don't wanna see it get worse, and I think for
yeah,
me, what we're seeing in at this moment in time is that, um, I don't think that Donald Trump feels very good about his chances of winning. I think it's gonna be very close, so, I think we always need to put that disclaimer there,
sure,
but I think he's worried about losing, and for him personally, and it was actually his niece, Mary Trump, that once told me this, is Trump's main concern is his own physical safety, the ability for him to be safe from harm. Now, I mean, he came within about 2 inches of being assassinated earlier this summer. So, I mean, I think that's a legitimate concern, especially if you believe that there was also a guy hiding in the woods near his golf course. Um, but for him, losing is not just about losing a political election, right? It's not just about not being president. It also means that he will now be liable for the first time in nearly 80 years for decades worth of malfeasance, and potentially, criminal behavior. And so, he is now, I think, feeling very cornered. And I think that's why you're seeing that his rhetoric, which is always amped up, anti democratic and dangerous, is getting even more so now because he has to get his people fired up so that as we get closer to November 5th, and again, it probably becomes a very close election, that he has the legitimacy to say there was something crooked, there was something wrong. Could you really trust the results? Because what he wants is not necessarily, I mean, he wants to win. Don't get me wrong. That would be the easiest
sure.
path for him. But short of that, he wants to be able to say that there's enough confusion or uncertainty. How could anybody say who really won? That's a win for him, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way of putting it, because he is. This is a game of survival for himself and the life he wants to live, and which is basically, you know, I can do whatever I want, and not gonna be punished for all the things I've done.
Right.
Um, thinking back then to like 2016, when it came to creating the Lincoln Project, obviously you're a co-founder. What were the talks going on in that moment? That led to its creation in an era of Trump just starting to emerge.
Well, I mean, I think that, in 2015, when he came down the escalator, again, many people, myself included, thought he was a joke. And then towards the end of the year, I was doing some work for a group we were doing significant, survey research across the country. And we realized pretty quickly that it was going to be Trump versus Clinton in the general election, even as far as back as December of 2015. And so, that was something for me. Said, well, okay, well, I have to make a personal decision here. And mine was, if this is what the Republican Party wants, like they can count me out,
Right.
right? So you fast forward to 2017, like no one was surprised that he wasn't a very good president. At least I wasn't.
Yeah.
Um, right. And because he said he was going to do all these things, and the people around him, there were still enough guardrails around him to prevent the most insanity. But he's got a lot of crazy, and it sort of seeps out through the edges. And then obviously COVID hit. But in 2019, right, it was really a bunch of us getting together who were like, okay, well, look, we have an opportunity here now. This really started in the summer of 2019. There
Yeah.
wasn't a plan. Let's be clear. We didn't have a plan,
Yeah.
right? Like there wasn't like some grand blueprint that we said, okay, here, here's the tome that we have created. Here is the playbook. It was really like, four guys, a fundraiser, a person who could build us a website, five guys, and an op-ed in the New York Times, right? That really
Yeah.
got us
Yeah.
started. And remember that when we launched in December of 2019, Trump had not been impeached for the first time. COVID had not hit. And it looked like either Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren were likely to be the nominee of the
Yeah.
Democratic Party for 2020. So, you go from the 4 weeks between when we spoke as a group at the Cooper Union in New York City, where we're on the 160th anniversary of when Abraham Lincoln had given his right makes might speech, to a month later when the world shuts down, that was, I mean, none of us could have expected that. And then obviously, they trade Sanders' potential victory for coalescing behind a Joe Biden, who I think they thought, and they turned out to be correct, was the only
Yeah,
person who could probably beat Trump. But we didn't. But even then, we didn't really take off. It wasn't until about the first week of May when we launched an ad called "Morning in America," which was a takeoff on the Hal Riney spot of the 1984 Reagan campaign, which was very positive. This was very sad, right? In the minor key,
sure.
sad music, downbeat, people in emergency rooms with lots of rainy imagery, et cetera, et cetera. Trump sees it because we pushed it into the White House, right? Because he's the easiest person to find. He attacks us on Twitter. And, we go from raising about $400,000 a month to raising $5 million in the next 3 weeks. And so, we took off, but, the Lincoln Project as sort of this incredible comet politically really stretched from about May, 3rd of 2020 till about, January 15th of 2021, right? It came and went pretty quickly, where we're still around. Don't get me wrong, but the ability to impact something, like that would just catch lightning in a bottle, whatever metaphor or
Yeah,
cliche you want to use. I think also had a lot to do with the time, which was everybody was locked in their houses.
yeah,
And no one had ever seen a bunch of, anybody from a party actively and aggressively taking on the sitting president of their own party. So there was just a
sure.
lot of unique stuff. And then obviously the ads were incredible. And,
Yeah, yeah, I
I think
remember.
that they scared off enough Republicans to say, I don't want this anymore, and then made Democrats happy. And so, it was an incredibly heady time. And, we were in it all day. There were days when we were dropping 5, 6, 7 different ads out onto social media, right? I mean, it was just
Wow.
an incredibly active time. But, that was one where, he lost. We knew he wasn't going to go quietly. We'd known that for months, but we didn't know what it was going to be. And then we saw what it was. And so January 6th comes. We have a riot. We have death, destruction. The certification goes forth. And within, a few weeks, Donald Trump has been exonerated by Senate Republicans. And, then Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy has gone to Mar-a-Lago to bend the knee, and he's right back at the top. I mean, I'll just tell you this, like the Republican Party had plenty of off ramps over the years to push this guy into the dustbin of history, and they refused to ever take him.
Yeah, I mean, it is unbelievable. Like, it's, I'm sure for you, especially, given your time in the political realm. I mean, I'm sure you're probably. I mean, were you surprised to see how McCain and Romney basically get pushed out of the party?
No, not at that point. Once
Okay,
once once he won in 2016 and he started consolidating political
yeah,
authority
you knew it was over.
amongst the GOP. Yeah, because
Okay,
I mean the Republican Party writ large, operationally, organizationally, was like one of those, bugs that gets, invaded by another bug, right? And the bug sort of
okay,
wears it as a skin, maybe a
sure,
zombie, whatever
yeah,
weird horror, idea you want to come up with. But that's Trump he very much recognized. I mean, we should not underestimate his instinctual capabilities.
yeah,
He is not a genius. He is not traditionally intelligent, as you might think of someone. But he has animal instincts. He has lizard brain instincts. And he realized that the Republican Party was ripe for the taking.
yeah,
And he met, and then you see that there was a conservative movement in this country. I don't even want to call it conservative. I don't know what right wing movement in this country that had been going, been building for 50 or 60 years, and it spent billions of dollars on infrastructure over the years. And they met their opportunity, right? If luck is when opportunity meets preparation, you know, they'd done the preparation and Trump was their opportunity. And so the Republican Party served as a vessel for him. And for these right wing ideologues, he served as a vessel for them.
yeah. It's obvious did pretty good job of finding blood in the water there, then going after the weak points and tearing the party apart into his own, now his own party, which
Yeah.
is still insane to think about. You go from the party of Lincoln to the party of Donald Trump, and he's actively talking about how he's better than Lincoln basically on social media all the time. It's
Yeah.
just unbelievable.
No one been treated. He was treated worse even than Lincoln.
That's right.
Uh,
That's right.
yeah.
Yeah,
I think Mrs. Lincoln would beg to differ, but
yeah, I mean, it's a wild world. It seems like a bad dream, but it
right.
continues to go on. So, you know, how do you feel then about the election coming up?
I think it's too close. I'd like to see, I'd like to see Kamala Harris and Tim Walz and and Democrats up and down the ballot, not just win, but win by a landslide.
Sure.
And I say that not as I'm not a Democrat.
Right.
I'm not going to be a Democrat. But I'm enough of a student of history myself to understand that, authoritarian movements come quickly. They don't last very long because they tend to eat themselves, but they do an enormous amount of damage that takes years or decades to finish, to fix or to repair once they're gone. And so that to me is the biggest concern is that, you know, Donald Trump could still win. He could be reelected. And I would venture to say now that, since his debate with Kamala Harris, which I think even he knew he did terribly in, and his people knew he did terribly in, he has really turned up the heat underneath his movement. And that's really what worries me is that
Yeah.
there are people out there who have been radicalized either to a minor extent or an extreme extent, who it won't necessarily be like of the Proud Boys marching around in their goofy get-ups, or the Boogaloo Boys, or the guys in the khaki shirt, the khaki pants and the white shirts and the tiki torches, but it will be individuals out there causing trouble, because they've gotten whatever message wired into their brain through Fox or Dan Bongino or Newsmax or Alex Jones or from Trump himself, right? I mean, Trump goes on Truth Social and posts like, "I hate Taylor Swift."
Yes, I saw
Like
that. Yeah.
that wasn't an accident,
Right.
right? Like that wasn't an accident. That was a call. That was a notice to his people, right? And when he says anybody who was involved in stealing 2020, even though remember he just admitted that he had quote lost by a whisker, um, that was a donor, a political operative, a lawyer, someone in government, right? They're on the list. Well, I believe him because I'm on the list, right? And so I think that there's a lot of us too who like for us, this is not just about the country,
Yeah.
right? Or about right or wrong or about democracy versus authoritarianism, but it's a pretty personal fight too, which is, he wins, like we got to make some serious decisions and decisions that in my lifetime you never thought you'd have to make.
I mean, so this is really crazy. So, I mean, so what can you explain what exactly this list is and how it was created and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think it's like, the Godfather and Michael Corleone,
Right.
Sonny
Yeah.
with a yellow legal pad, but I mean, the bottom line is, let's just take us personally, right? So, back in going back to the week after election day 2020, we realized that what had happened was that once Biden had been deemed president elect by the media, they went immediately into transition mode, right? We have to go build a government. But that left a gap for Trump and his people to start filling the airwaves with this is stolen, this is stolen, this is stolen. And so now their attorneys fan out across the country. Well, we went after, through various methods, whether or not it was the media, whether or not it was people, we were having people call these law firms and ask why they were doing this when they knew that they didn't have a case, it was anti-democratic. So we scared off most of their big law firms. Well, it came out in the summer of 2022 that Mark Meadows who was chief of staff at the White House at the time, had someone in their orbit compile a dossier on me, my other co-founder Rick Wilson, and a senior advisor to the Lincoln Project, Stuart Stevens, and he sent this dossier to Bill Barr, and it says, "Here's the Lincoln Project information I mentioned." Right,
Wow.
so that's 2020. Right. So it's all well and good to say, "Oh, I don't know." But, I mean, look, I don't want to overstate this. Again, I
Sure.
don't know what the list looks like, but anybody who's been at it as long as we have, right? Like he knows who we are. The people around him know who we are. I mean, in 2020, remember, they came after us, right? In 2021, excuse me, in the spring of 2021, they engaged in a massive smear campaign against me and my co-founders, mailers, different stuff to our neighbors, all these other things,
My gosh.
lies in the media. And so, they blamed us for him losing. Now, I'd like to believe that we played a part, but they believed it. And they were willing to do what they thought. And so if he wins, again, it won't just be us. It'll be anybody who worked for him, who turned on him, the Nancy Pelosi's of the world. But, Republicans who have never been loyal, not loyal enough, right? There's these, when groups like these take over, right? There's always before anything else, there's always an internal purge, right? There's a
Yep.
loyalty test. And then they move out into different concentric circles. And so it's one of those things where, again, it's hard to believe that this could happen here. But it also makes me wake up every day very motivated to make sure that every voter I can find to vote for Kamala Harris, I go out and tell them this is what you got to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think your calculations are exactly right because we've seen stuff like this play out in history, and though it's hard to fathom it happening in America, like who's to say it can't happen in America either? It's
Right.
these things are unpredictable, and I mean, yeah, I think the logical step is, especially the more an authoritarian or authoritarian wannabe, gets control, kind of the more people they go after over time, because it's like, okay, who's next on my list? So it,
Right.
it may be like people like you at the beginning, but it's a lot of other people later on. So
Well, because there's always, remember too that, as you
yeah,
know, as being a historian, whether or not it's a right wing authoritarian or
yep,
left wing authoritarian, part of the deal is that there has to be an ongoing struggle. There always has to be an enemy.
right, yeah,
So, like, once you get rid of the quote unquote real enemies, you got to go make some up,
right,
right? You
yeah,
got to go find some.
yeah, yeah,
And you think about, yeah, I mean, it could have been 1933, 1934, and the Night of the Long Knives. It could have been Stalin's purges. It could have been Pinochet in Chile, right after after Allende was gone and all his people. They had to keep finding others, right, to say, well, these are the enemies of the state that we have to protect you from. And it's not terribly complicated. It's even less sophisticated.
sure,
It's just a matter, and then of course you have, power organs, the authorities, like they like this stuff, right? They want to go beat some people up. They want to go round some people up. And Trump and his people are saying not only are there the political opponents, but he also wants to deport 11 or 12 million people. So
yeah,
like his power ministries are going to be awful busy.
yeah. I mean, I think the Truth Social post he put out on Memorial Day, calling people human scum that were, that didn't support him. Yeah,
Yeah.
basically made it pretty clear in my mind that okay, this is getting to a whole new level of insanity, and just like watch out if he gets elected again. So
Yeah, no, and again, I think, there was that time in 2016 where it's like you should take him seriously, but not literally, right? Because
mhm.
again, nobody had ever seen anything like him. And we're like, no, you should take him seriously and literally,
Yeah,
right? Like
well, yeah,
he's not going to go say, I think we need to go find this person at this time, at this place, and do this thing with them. He's going to say, I want all those people. I want all that taken care of. Right. And then the people around him will determine what the details of that are. Right. They will,
sure,
in the context of, early 30s Germany, they will work towards Trump. Right. They will work towards what they think his vision is. And they will take that vision, I assume, as expansive until somebody tells them to stop.
yeah. I mean, I've asked multiple people this now. I'm curious what your thoughts are. Do you think the Supreme Court still serves as a potential stopgap to Trump, or do you think that they're just, based on the recent decisions, especially, do you think they're kind of caving?
They've caved. I don't think
Okay,
there's no
yeah,
gerund involved
the
anymore. No, they
immunity
have.
decision and yeah,
Yeah,
all
the
these, yeah,
the immunity decision
yep,
was everything. I was participating with a bunch of very, very smart people in some simulations put on by the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University about what a Trump, another Trump term would look like the first 30, 60, 120 days. And we were conducting all of these before that immunity decision came down. And even the people who were playing the federal judiciary, who were, again, in many cases, former prosecutors, former law clerks, like these are people who knew the federal justice system, were basically, I was on the red team, right? The red team, played Steve Bannon-esque type character. Were basically giving us everything we wanted because it had been clear that that's what they were going to do. And that, whether or not it was a district court or the Fifth Circuit in New Orleans or now the Supreme Court itself, the revelations here that it was John Roberts of all people who was instrumental in making sure that the immunity decision was as good and positive an outcome as it could have been for Trump was frankly surprising to me.
Yeah,
But
I
again,
was
I guess
too.
I should stop being surprised.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, um, yeah. So this was like some type of war game type situation where you map
Yeah,
out all the potential things that could happen, and
right.
everyone plays a role, and like what how democracy would stand, if someone were
Yeah,
to do this and that.
and the problem is that for people who want to tear it down,
Yeah,
right? The way that federal executive authority has developed over the last, let's say, since World War II, for lack of a better way to put it, um, it's incredibly expansive. There's almost nothing that a president can't do, especially with a Supreme Court ruling like the immunity thing. And
yeah,
let's
well,
be clear
yeah,
that even if a federal court said stop doing that, who's the enforcement mechanism for the judiciary? The
sure,
executive,
right,
right? So they're like, no. I mean, you could have a situation that people talk about the military and all this. Like, I think that's possible, but if you know that you have, however many hundreds of thousands of federal law enforcement officers, many of whom I assume would do what they were asked because they see it as their duty, and then you have friendly, state heads of state police forces, friendly sheriffs. The idea, I didn't even know this, like the Marshal Service, like they deputize people all the time for different operations they're doing. Right. So like you could have that, you just wave a magic wand and say, okay, these people have been deputized as deputy U.S. Marshals for the next 90 days. Well, that gives them a hell of a lot of immunity,
yeah,
from anything. And so, yeah, it's pretty scary stuff. And the problem is that there's not a lot of practical recourse, if I make that make sense. Like, you can write an op-ed or you can have hearings or you can say, I'm not going to do this, Congress is going to cut off money and all that. But those are like baby speed bumps, right? If somebody
sure.
really wants to do this stuff, it's very if a president really wants to do this, it's very, very difficult to stop them.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and I mean, I hope that if you were to win again, I'd hope that there'd be something that, something that could stop him. I don't know. I don't know. That really disturbs me. Um, but what does the future look like after Trump? That's why I'm curious because he is, pretty old at this point. I'm wondering, like, what does an heir to the Trump movement look like?
Well, I don't think you're going to have one for a while.
Okay.
And I think this is an important thing to understand too, is that when Donald Trump loses, and I do think he'll lose.
Yeah.
First of all, he's not going away.
Yeah.
That's not in his DNA. Yeah, I mean, maybe he'll, you know, if it's a big enough blowout, right, and there are enough people at the local level saying like, I'm not going to federal prison for this guy,
Hmm.
then maybe we'll get through pretty quietly. But he's going to be facing federal charges. He's going to be facing hundreds and millions of dollars of fines he still has to pay, I assume. Um, and he cannot be out of the spotlight. He's preternaturally, always looking for something. So he'll say something crazy. But let's just fast forward. Let's say the 2025 is like he's wounded, metaphorically. Let's say in the 2026 primary elections, right, for the midterms there, you could still make an argument that that the endorsement that most of these MAGA candidates are going to want is going to be Donald Trump's,
Yeah.
right? Because the primary voter, who is someone who shows up, when most general election voters don't, let's just call it the 50% of the party that's most energized all the time. Like these are MAGA people now. There is no like establishment wing, right? There's a few tailings of people who used to call themselves establishment, but MAGA runs the party. And so, he will still be the person who I assume the Republican National Committee goes to help raise money, right? Because his name is probably still going to drive more contributions than anybody else. The trouble will come for him probably post 2026 midterms when some of these younger, guys, for the most part, now want to have their own shot at being president. Now, Trump could run again. I don't think he will,
Yeah. Yeah.
but he'd be 82, and that seems silly, but I wouldn't put it past him if he's still around. And, the Josh Hawleys from Missouri and the Ted Cruzes from Texas and Tom Cottons from Arkansas, all in Ron DeSantis from Florida, like these people all want their shot. And my guess is they're probably not going to want to wait until 2032, right? to have their opportunity, because the whole, politics is, running for high office is really all a matter of timing and positioning, and frankly, just a lot of luck. Are you in the right place at the right time? Um, and there are going to be a lot of people who, well, there's other governors, there's other senators, there's other people who've come online. And so, and then there's the practical piece of, I'll call it the neo-Confederacy, right?
Hmm.
Um, the people that are running those places now, they're either the biggest cynics that have ever lived, or they're true believers, or they started as cynics and they become true believers. But like, my guess is Oklahoma is not getting less red anytime soon.
No, probably not.
Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida's a little bit different. But I would say that, the Mountain West where I live, the MAGA types in these states are going to consolidate their positions. They're not going to give them up. And so I think that, think about beating Trump as like the first step to like surviving the car wreck. Like that all right, you've had the car wreck and you're alive, right?
Yeah.
But now they got to get the jaws of life to get you out, and you still got to go to the hospital. Like there's a lot of work to be done after they say, okay,
Right.
you're going to live, but you broke 82 bones, right?
Pretty much.
You're probably going to be okay if you do everything right and you listen to your doctors, but it's no guarantee, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great way of explaining it. Yeah, it is a fascinating in a bad way time to think about all the potential futures in store for the country. And I always wonder jokingly, like, what is like Donald Trump Jr.'s future? If Trump dies of old age eventually, like is he going to try to take over the MAGA movement? Will the MAGA movement be receptive to that, or is someone else going to come in? Or
It's a really good question. I mean, I think the problem for all of them is that like they're all in on the grift,
yeah,
right? They like the fame and the money and the adoration, but I just don't know that Trump has a very specific way of communicating with his
yes,
people. And look, we've seen this throughout history too, right? Is that dictators really don't do succession, right? Like
yeah,
it's not
yeah,
really something that ever works,
yeah,
because again, they're never going to groom anybody to be next.
yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, and other people will say, well, no, Don Jr.'s a goon and Eric's an idiot and, yada, yada, yada. And so you'll have other people out there trying to take the reins of what's left of the movement. I think it will start to degrade once Trump moves off the scene, because he is so critical to holding it together. But again, there are lots of people who have said at the top who've spent lots of money and lots of time building this thing, and they're not going to give up the fight either.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, it is also like there's so many examples around the world of kind of authoritarians that basically create such a strong cult of personality that they're irreplaceable.
Mhm.
And then it just kind of becomes chaos after they leave. So
Yeah, I mean, look what happened to so Stalin dies in what, 1953,
yep,
and then I think in 1956 it becomes public that Nikita Khrushchev had given this speech that denounced all of the things that Stalin had ever done,
right,
right? You could make an argument that whenever Trump finally, shuffles off his mortal coil, right, that there will be some people who try and take that mantle, but there will be a whole bunch of people too who say
yeah,
this was a time we should not go back to, right? This is not, he was for some good things, but the truth is that the things he did made things too hard for everybody else, yada, yada, yada. Because at some point, Republicans, not in very red states, but nationally, like are going to want to reclaim power. Now, we only have a two-party system,
hmm,
so it's not as hard as it might otherwise be in, say, a multi-party, democracy, or multi-party parliamentary system, because it only takes enough voters getting fed up with one side to say, well, I guess I got to vote for these other jerks
yeah,
because the jerks
yep,
I got I don't like.
yeah, that's true. I mean, I'd hope that the Republican Party might become more moderate over time again, and kind of get away from the crazy wagon after Trump, because really, I mean, I think the success of our country depends a lot on having two fairly healthy parties that can kind of counteract each other.
Sure.
And if you have that balance out of whack, then you get the insanity that is today.
Yeah, and look, I mean, any of the states we see that have one party in power for an extended period of time, it doesn't work out right.
No,
Look,
no,
I went to high school and college in Texas. It's not working
yeah,
out right there. I lived
yep,
and worked in California for 10 years. It's not really working out there either. right? The things that keep those states moving forward is the fact that they have enormous populations, very educated workforces, a lot of industry, right? Like the political system makes life harder for individuals, right? And sometimes for businesses or whatever. But the truth is that like the inertia of those places keeps them moving forward far more than the political systems do.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, I grew up in Kansas, and I know when the state government went bankrupt under the Brownback years, it was interesting to see. Now there's a Democrat governor, and just the people get fed up with if things are dominated too much by one political party. So
Yeah, and they're really not fans of incompetence either,
you're
right?
right.
I mean,
Yeah,
they expect their, I mean, Americans, we always have a pretty jaundiced view of our politicians, right? I mean, it's like,
yeah,
if you're president in another time, not now, but if you were president in another time and you were like 52 or 53% approval, like you were really popular,
yeah, yeah.
right? Like you
That's
were
it's
really
crazy,
popular.
but yeah, that's it. Yeah,
Now we're like the French, right? If you're like in the high 30s, you're doing okay,
it's
right?
right.
Like if the French president's at like 20% approval, which means 80% of the country doesn't like him,
Yeah,
then like they're really happy at the Elysee
right.
Palace.
Popular guy.
Right, he's a popular guy.
Yeah.
And so I think that's unfortunately where we are too, which is broad popular support is pretty tough to come by right now.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great point. So, what then do you have to say to people that, maybe they don't pay much attention to politics and they're like, okay, I'm not sure what to do about this election. Maybe should I vote? Or if I'm going to vote, who should I vote for? What would you say to those people then?
Well, I don't know who first said it, but there's an expression which is you can ignore politics, but politics doesn't ignore you. And so I would say this is that if you are registered to vote, make your plan to vote, whether or not that's voting early, voting by mail, if it's possible in your state, or finding yourself, finding your own polling place. I think you can go to like voter.org or vote.gov, voterizer.org. There's a lot of different places, or your own state's secretary of state or chief elections official, whoever it is, just type that in, you'll find it. And if you're not registered, then you should register. Most registration deadlines aren't till very close to the election day itself. Some are on election day. But again, I know that it sounds hokey to say this, but if you don't participate, then you really can't complain because you've chosen not to make a decision. And everybody says, "Oh, my vote doesn't count." Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Ask Al Gore if
Yeah.
how much 538 votes in Florida mattered. Ask the people in Georgia how much 11,280 votes mattered. Ask anybody. I mean, these races are coming down to slivers of margins we're not used to, right? I mean, we're electorally speaking, 11,000 votes is not, you're not going to find 11,000 votes, right, in a
Sure.
state the size of Georgia. But it's too close for comfort, right? It shouldn't be 10,000. It should be 50,000. If it's 50,000, it should be 100,000. And that's, individuals coming together collectively to create, that mass of, I'll call it almost, a bio defense, right? Political defense of the body politic. And if we have too many people who don't believe it matters, they won't show up. And then, we'll all be dealing with the outcome of apathy or antipathy.
Yeah. No, I love that quote because it is so true that, and you see it around the world, people kind of take, whatever freedoms, whatever amount of freedoms they have, they take it for granted and they assume like,
Right.
oh, politics doesn't really matter. I'm just gonna continue to live my life. Eventually politics will come to you because they'll come to you with some issue that, your human rights are being stripped away, or, maybe your kids could be sent off to some war, for some dictator to, to conquer some
Right.
land. And it's like you can't hide from things forever. So
No, and it's I think it was Martin Niemöller who said, first they came for the socialists, but I wasn't a socialist, and they came for the Jews and I wasn't a Jews, and then they came for me, right? Like that's how it works.
yeah.
In the worst expression of authoritarian or totalitarianism is that nobody gets left alone.
Yeah, no, very true. So what are you currently working on then? And also you talk a little bit about like your organization, the union, and what you
Sure.
do there.
Yeah, so join the union .us. We started the union inside the Lincoln Project back in the spring of 2022. We just have Lincoln has such a broad, and big bullhorn. We said, okay, well, we should really try and organize volunteers down in the states that we know are going to matter. So we really started organizing them ahead of the 2022 midterms, specifically in places that, again, are important: Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. To ensure that back then that pro-democracy candidates were in charge of elections and the state houses when the 2024 election came around. And so now, we have 50,000, almost 60,000 volunteers nationwide. We have, leadership teams in all of what we call our existential states. I was just in Pennsylvania for the weekend, canvassing in, outside of Philadelphia, and then in Pittsburgh. I'm headed to North Carolina and to Michigan and to Arizona and to Florida and to Wisconsin. You name it, I'm going to be there. And so, and we have more than 100 partner organizations, and we provide access to about 2,000 volunteer opportunities on any given day. We update them regularly. And so it doesn't matter if you live in Nome, Alaska, or, Orlando, Florida, you can get involved with us. Again, it's jointheunion.us. And look, we are nonpartisan, right? We're not Democrats. We're not Republicans. We're not independents. We're a little bit of everything. And we have members from across the political spectrum. We don't focus on issues so much as we focus on the idea that we don't have to agree on everything. We just have to agree on one thing. And for that moment now, like, we'll all come together. We'll work with anybody. Like I said, we have had enormous success with our partner groups. And so, our job is just to make sure that every available vote for the pro-democracy candidate, from Kamala Harris all the way down to dog catcher, that can show up, will show up. And then, as we get through this year, we'll look forward to, what comes next. There's still a lot of work to be done, not just electorally, but politically, from an issue perspective, from an infrastructure perspective. Look, the right-wing authoritarian movement in this country has stolen a 50-year march on us, understanding how to communicate to people. And I'm not saying we should go in with propaganda. I'm not saying we should go in through with ugliness. But I think we have a lot of we have more than 100 groups who are ready, willing, and able to say, okay, how do we rebuild a culture of democracy and decency, starting at the local level and laddering up from there. And then, of course, you've got, I've got the home front, which is both my Substack and my podcast, which I hope you'll check out. I give you an update with guests about what's going on. The next few weeks will be dedicated specifically to the campaign and the things around it. And my Substack is just really, the insight that I've gotten over, it's hard to believe, 25 years in politics. I just wrote a couple of pieces about being in Pennsylvania and seeing some of the things I saw at the doors there. This is a fight that, again, we can do it, we will do it, but it takes all of us. So I really do thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you for everything and coming on. The work that you do is really inspiring, and it gives me hope, especially because it can be easy to, see headlines and be like, wow, these are pretty dark times, and I'm living through history I don't want to live through. But seeing all the work you do does make me think, there's enough people out there that we can, protect our country and ensure that, democracy is still something that's gonna be the lifeblood of it.
Absolutely. And thank you so much again for having me. And everybody, I hope you will get involved. There's no excuse not to get involved. You can do it from your phone. You can do it from your laptop. You can get out on the doors. You can go to a field office, whatever it is. And we need poll watchers, right? We need poll workers. We need folks who are going to volunteer to hand out water where it's legal. And all, to drive. Like, there's no shortage of jobs that have to happen. And they don't happen, magically, and they don't happen automatically. They only happen when, enough people get together and get the job done.
Yeah, no, definitely. And people can follow you all across social media as well, correct?
Yeah. So on Twitter and TikTok, it's at Reed Galen, ReedGalen. And over on Threads and Threads and Instagram, it's at Reed_Galen USA.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for coming on. I really appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me.